Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you again for another Film Fanatic video. This is my third video in this series of my coverage of a full franchise, and that is all things Dracula tied to the beloved British horror company that still does exist, Hammer Studios. Just an amazing legacy, and this has been a series of videos and a show I've been wanting to get to. And I don't know, it's a funny thing. I feel like I'm kind of indebted to this company and to these movies, just because I feel like I'm indebted to talk about them because how much they have played a part in my love of horror films, vampire movies. They were my first time as a kid. It was my first time as a kid seeing Dracula on the big screen. It was my first initiation to discovering Christopher Lee. You know, just one of the most iconic horror figures. Peter Cushing, just amazing. I didn't read Bram Stoker's novel, the original novel of Dracula. I didn't read that until probably like 11th or 12th grade. So I grew up watching all of these great classic Hammer films for quite a few years before I had read the original novel, and I realized how different these movies are and how just campy they are and just how lovable they are. And but yet they, push the envelope. Particularly yesterday, I did a show on one of these great films, and I talked about Terence Fisher, who was a director for Hammer, and he, worked on quite a few of the Dracula movies starring Christopher Lee. And he really, as a director, and especially now in the context of how I've been watching this whole franchise, I realized how Terence Fisher as a director was really pushing the envelope when it came to sexual themes and violence and things that were shown or not shown or things that you could show on the big screen. From the late 50s through the 60s, 70s, just it's wild, and especially the early phase of Hammer, they really did push the envelope, and it really, I love these movies to death. You know, it's obviously it's an obvious thing of where being really nostalgic around these films, and what the time period, the time frame where I was at as a kid, as a person, when I was exposed to these movies. So it really has a deep connection to my childhood. I almost feel like this franchise and all things Hammer is just, I would say it's just as deep as the impact that the Friday the 13th franchise had. Those are the two, essentially the first two franchise horror things that I ever got exposed to. And I, was obsessed with both franchises, and I just, every chance I could get to watch any of those films, I would, whether it was I remember with the Hammer films in particular, the early stages of cable, I remember there was a whole ton of the Hammer films of where they were always on television. And typically as a kid, I'd watch these movies all the time, and they were on various networks or channels or stations. They were like constantly on. Sometimes they would show two or three back to back, and it was just an amazing time. And then that tied in with VHS. I used to rent them as well. I didn't buy any of these movies until I didn't start buying any of the Hammer films of where I actually owned them until probably when I was in, my 20s, when I was in college. That's when I got, when I got into my 20s and maybe a year or two before I went to college, but definitely like while I was at college and definitely when I got out of college, I started buying movies, my early 20s. I started buying my first editions of, movies that I loved as on DVD. Some of the first movies I ever bought, I bought Alien, Ridley Scott's Alien. I remember buying 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick. I also remember buying The Shining, also by Stanley Kubrick, which is probably my favorite, or is my favorite Kubrick film by my favorite director. And also Blade Runner. Those movies were in constant rotation. I was obsessed with all four or five of those movies. I used to watch them all the time, and I remember I was still, yeah, I was in my 20s, and I was living at home for a while after where my folks had moved to Maine, and I was going back and forth. But there was a chunk of time where I was living there until I eventually moved out. But I had a little man cave in the basement of the house, and I had just gotten my first DVD player with a surround sound system. Some of it actually still works, which is crazy. But I remember when I first my first purchases of buying movies, DVDs, and it was right when DVDs were huge. DVDs were a huge thing on the market for home entertainment, and those were the movies I bought right away. And I used to watch those movies constantly, and it was awesome. So right around that time, I got the bug and I started buying more movies. And over the next few years, I started buying lots of other films way before Blu-ray, 4K, all that fun stuff. But I remember buying all of the Hammer films. I have all of the Hammer films, even the ones that were the non-Dracula ones. I have all of them on DVD. I only own one or two on Blu-ray, which I don't know why. I've come across a few on Blu-ray and obviously 4K. Like now they're all available. But I don't know. The reason I think I haven't bought any on Blu-ray or 4K is some of the editions I've seen are not really. They're great, but they're not really. I feel like worth that extra price to pay, maybe $20 or $25, just because some of the editions I've come across are not like really packed with special features. I'm a huge, well, film fanatic, but I'm a huge, film nerd. But when I buy a movie, I really try to seek out, the special features aspect of it, because movies that I love and movies that I get excited about, I love to find out, you know, how they were made and what influenced those movies. What was the inspiration for the actors, and especially, I'm a huge fan of when there's a interview or a documentary with the writers or the director of the film, where really focuses on the heart and soul of that project. And it's not like the cliche, kind of thing of where it's just like a 5 minute interview. I really love like the in depth stuff of where, it might be a couple hours, or, documentaries on the film itself. So I usually seek those out. And I haven't really come across those for the Hammer films, which I've been surprised. Like I said, I own all of the movies on DVD. I only have one or two. I have Scars of Dracula on Blu-ray, which is actually really good. That actually has some really great interviews with Christopher Lee, and it's got some great interviews and commentary tracks by Terrence Fisher. But other than that, not very many. In as far as packages go, and especially special features. And I haven't come across too many Blu-ray or 4K editions where it's a thing. maybe it's just stuff. Maybe it's just a thing of where I've missed it, or I just haven't come across them yet. But I definitely want to. Quality wise, I'm pretty happy with the DVDs I have for the most part. They're pretty good transfers, and they're all pretty good quality. I do actually, and I own for a few of the Hammer films. I have like a few, 3 or 4 different copies of that particular film. I have a few. I have a few of them also on VHS. So, but you know, it's an essential thing, and it's something for me that being that these movies are so influential on me. And the thing is, watching them in succession, which I love doing when I do these series of where I'm trying to do these videos of where I'm covering a full franchise. What I usually do is I watch each movie in succession, and it's super fun, and a lot of new things come to mind, and I actually it actually kind of paints a different picture of the film, and the experience is different for me, and I notice certain things that I didn't notice before, so it's kind of an interesting way to do it. But that's what I'm doing right now when it comes to the Dracula films. So it's actually a total blast. I'm totally enjoying it. So one of the funniest things when I just mentioned that I've had these funny little revelations, and watching these films in succession is always a real eye opening experience. I found myself, well, the one time it really happened, it was a big shift for me, was the Friday 13th series. There was when I watched part 4, Jason Lives. I've always liked that movie, but I remember watching it in the context, in succession of each of those films, because I have all of those movies on Blu-ray. I have the whole box set. And when I watched that movie, I always liked that movie. I thought it was good, but I was never like, you know, bonkers for it. I was never like, it was never on my top of that tier. It was never, my favorites were always, I always loved the first one and the final chapter. Those are always my favorite, and I was always like, those automatically always went to the top. But it was interesting watching all those movies in succession. I realized, wait, part 5, and that was the only. I remember seeing that movie actually in the theater when I was a kid, and that movie I always thought was pretty good. I thought it was solid. But I watched it in the context, of each, where I was watching each movie in succession, and I was like, wow, like this movie is awesome. And since then, I've watched it a few times, and this was like a few months ago when I did when I did the coverage of the Friday 13th franchise. And I've seen it, part 5 a few times since then, Jason Lives, and now it's one of my favorites. It's almost my favorite movie now of the franchise. It's crazy because now I love that movie. I think it's such an awesome movie. I think it's a standalone movie. So now that movie has like really been bumped to the top, and now that's one of my favorites, and it's one of the most original. I think in the series, and it's definitely from a technical standpoint the most beautifully shot film. So it's really interesting. So I see that when I do these kinds of experiments, or where I explore a franchise, and again, these are all movies I've seen lots of times, but I come to this realization in watching it in a context where certainly certain films hit me harder. I did another big show on the Halloween franchise, and I've always had mixed things around certain films around that. For me, it's always been, you know, obviously the first one, the debut from in '79 from John Carpenter, the original Halloween. I've always loved Season of the Witch is, probably my favorite in the franchise, but I actually, I love that movie to death, and and the rest of the films in the franchise, I've always been like, nah, okay, they're all right. But then I watched H2O, which was definitely a much later one, and I was blown away by how awesome that movie is. And now that movie is one of my favorites. That and you know with the other two with Halloween 3, Season of a Witch, and the original Halloween. But H2O, I was just blown away by how awesome that movie is. And again, I think that had something to do with, I'd seen that movie a couple times before, and I was like, it's okay. I thought it was one of the more, in the past, I always felt that was one of the more mediocre films. But now I love that movie, and I can't wait to buy that on Blu-ray at some point. Yeah. And the other one, the other big revelation for me too, which was really a huge surprise. The last three Halloween films directed by David Allen Green. Not a huge fan of those films. I think they're okay, but not a huge fan. But the third one, which I saw in the theater and then I saw again on DVD, I found myself actually really liking that movie. And I've seen a lot of parallels between that movie, Halloween Ends, and also Season of the Witch, Halloween 3. And so, very surprising watching things in the context. So, watching this franchise, I've been doing the same thing. Although I'm not watching it in succession, I'm just kind of watching the movies as they go because there's a few of them and I'm just trying to keep it a little more loose. I'm not really being too anal about it. But I'm watching all of them now, and so this week it's been a blast because I've been revisiting these movies. And the funny thing is I got this is my third show, and so I started watching. The movie I started watching last night was this guy here, Count Dracula and His Vampire Brides. And I've seen, again, it's similar to all the other franchises and all of these other movies that I've talked about. I've seen all of these movies countless times, especially the Hammer films. But one of the funniest things happened when I started watching this. I'm like, no, wait, I've this is the same movie as the Satanic Rites of Dracula, which was a movie in the series and in this franchise coverage that I was going to get to, which is one of my favorites. It's probably, it's definitely right up there with, the other ones that I really love. And or like Dracula's Risen from His Grave is one that I really, really love. And then also Dracula AD. I love that movie to death. And also Satanic Rites of Dracula those have been my three favorites. But again, I love all of them. They're all awesome. But when I was watching it, I'm like, wait, no, this is the same. I got maybe 35 minutes into it or so, and I'm like, wait, this is the same movie. What the heck's going on here? And I finished it, and I really like this movie, and I've seen this a bunch of times, but for some reason I didn't realize. Oh wait, this is exactly the same exact movie, but with a different title as the Satanic Rites of Dracula. And I was just like, what the heck's going on here? So I looked it up, and I realized that this is an edited version of it. This is like, a version that was released later. Because originally, the Satanic Rites of Dracula was the original movie, the original title, but for whatever reason, they ended up editing it, and they shelved this movie for quite a while. It wasn't released when it was first directed, and when the movie was finished, it was initially just kind of put on the back burner, and then they released it under a different title, and it's an edited version. And it's funny because I don't see, from an editing perspective, I don't see any difference between these movies. These movies are exactly the same. I don't see any difference as far as like scenes being cut or anything. The only thing that's different is the artwork and the title. And so it's pretty interesting. And I think that they, from what I've read about this, they changed the title because they thought maybe it was too controversial. So they changed the title from The Satanic Rites of Dracula, which was its original name, to Count Dracula and His Vampire Brides. So they're initially the same. They're exactly the same movie. But the movie itself, I don't notice anything different. I don't notice anything being centered. Pretty wacky, because this movie is pretty wacky. It's essentially, this is one of the more wacky films out of the whole franchise because it's essentially centered around this like you know supposed satanic cult that worships the devil, but the devil is Dracula, played by Christopher Lee in this. And there's also this conspiracy of these scientists that are working together to bring about this like bubonic plague and basically kill everyone on the planet and take over it and kill all of the humans. And that's kind of the whole premise of the story. And this was too the last film in the Hammer films that Christopher Lee did as Dracula, which is wild. And this movie's great. It's super schlocky. The storyline and the whole kind of plot line of it is pretty wacky and kind of kind of stupid, but it's still just so awesome. I think it's probably one of the more campy ones out of and again they're all the Hammer films are known for their really their real heavy schlocky kind of presentations. They're the over the top acting and where the script is and the story is a little bit cockamamie at times and doesn't have obviously anything to really do with the original tale of Dracula, but they're still so awesome. And I think it's again the case where something can be so bad it's good, and I think that these films are definitely that an example of that. And in particular, the Satanic Rites of Dracula, where I feel like it's probably one of the most schlocky ones in all of the films, and it's pretty silly, but it's great. It's all it was all done in the '70s, so it's got this great '70s music, and the whole like conspiracy theory with this like supposed satanic organization is just hilarious. This came out in 1973. It was directed by Alan Gibson, and I forgot too that this movie was the last film that Christopher Lee did as Dracula, which is wild. And he made these films. The first one was in 1958, which was Dracula's Risen from His Grave. And 72 or 73 was the last one. So he made these films for a very long time. And this is the follow-up to Dracula AD, which came out in 1972, and I really love that movie. That movie is also really schlocky and over the top, and it's also centered around this, this group of people that are part of this like supposed satanic occult group, and it's great and hilarious because there's all these like ritual scenes. There's lots of nudity and there's blood. There's people being sacrificed. It's great, and it's hilarious. The thing is too that's always funny where movies that are say horror movies that have an occult theme or where they're centered on people who worship the devil and all these things. And I'm a huge fan of exploitation movies that deal with that. The devil, Satan's Blood is one of my all-time favorites, and that's a Spanish exploitation movie, and it's centered on this essentially. It's kind of similar to Rosemary's Baby, only it's like really dirty and it's super sleazy and it's really graphic, but it's amazing. But it's centered on these like people who are like supposed devil worshippers. And it's got the trappings. It's got where they have all these great, amazing ritual scenes of where there's like candles and altars and statues and where the practitioners perform these invocations. And it's super over the top. Another great movie that takes that idea and just goes crazy with it is The Devil's Reign. That's another movie that's centered on a cult, this satanic cult kind of thing. And I love it. I love movies that have that as the centerpiece. So I have quite a few movies that I try to seek out those, even though they're not really, but the satanic oriented horror films. Satanic Pandemonium is another one that is just gonzo crazy and just awesome. And I've done a show. I did shows on all three of these movies. And the thing is too, they're not like they're not in all actuality, if a person takes the time and looks at, say alternative religions, whether it's like, because I mean now, even now, unfortunately, but even now we live in a predominantly a Christian Judeo society. I think it's changed and shifted, and there's been a maybe to a degree a shift into a progressive way of thinking, or maybe a little bit more tolerance for people who don't subscribe to those systems, but it's still the prevailing way of how the majority of people, when it comes to organized religion, it's still the predominant and the dominant, religions or religion in the world. But I think there has been a little bit more of a tolerance to certain things. But for the most part, when it comes to like the occult itself, like obviously in the 60s, there was a huge explosion. There was all of this social upheaval that was going on. People were exploring various forms of different philosophies, sexual practices, different lifestyles, political alternatives. So there was all of these new things, and the occult as a movement or a thing, it was an explosion. So suddenly you had people who had an interest, and they were practicing various forms of what was called the occult. Whether it was Wicca or Santeria or Voodoo, pagan, you know, pagan religions, pagan traditions, Celtic, Nordic, Satanism, atheism. I mean, what have you. There was all of this. There was an interest in the work of Aleister Crowley, the Order of the Golden Dawn, all of these different things that were, they're kind of labeled as like alternative beliefs. And there was this massive explosion and an interest, and there's still a huge interest in it. And I think to a degree, there's been almost a rekindling of that interest. I think, the past few years. But as far as like movies that have a satanic bent on it, or it's centered on like quote unquote Satanism, if you like take the time and actually like do a little bit of research on what Satanism is, it has very little or nothing to do with what these films kind of portray. I look at these films as being pure entertainment, and they're just fun as hell. They're sleazy, they're cheesy, and they're just great forms of escapism. That's it. I think there's some similarities as far as the aesthetics around some of these films, and particularly like films that have a satanic, well, not a real satanic, but like quote unquote satanic, way of how they present the movies, or an aesthetic. There's similarities, I think, from the aesthetics, with the use of symbolism and the theatrics. But beyond that, it has nothing to do with the actual religion of Satanism. And so I always keep that in mind. Like, there isn't, if one takes the time to go on to the Church of Satan website, or actually read any of the books written by the founder of the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey, you see, all those questions will be answered within 5 minutes, and you'll see that there's no use of animal sacrifice, or there's no there's nothing, it has nothing to do with kidnapping children and eating, the flesh of people and all of this bullshit. Because that's pure, that stuff all stems from, unfortunately, reality of like things of that happened during the Satanic Panic, where the occult and specifically Satanism was being attacked, and that was all perpetrated by these right wing Christian fundamentalists. But if you take the time to actually understand what Satanism is, as far as in regards to like how it's portrayed in some of these films, you realize no, it actually it's totally the opposite. Like life is actually a really precious thing. It's the most precious thing, and especially when it comes to animals and children. You know, their magical way of being is the most kind of celebrated part of humanity, and that is, you know, from a satanic perspective. So the idea of killing that or destroying it flies in the face and is against at you know and every is against every core of the being of the idea of Satanism in every way possible. So it's interesting, but I always, you know, I still am really attracted to these films because of the aesthetics and the, you know, and you know, Satanism does have a idea of ritual magic, where Satanism does have that as a part of it. So there is like a theatrical component. So that to me, I see that in a lot of the films, and I see like those things are what really allure me. And you know, in regards to what Satanism thinks, or how the practice of ritual in Satanism is really, it's really set up as, initially it's psychodrama, and it's basically a form of like self-realization. It's a form of psychodrama, and it's a form of basically, you know, things that can weigh you down, whether they're, you know, heavy personal things or financial things, whatever it is, like things that eventually come to the surface, but you're not addressing them, but they can weigh you down and really affect you as a person in a negative way. And the use of ritual is basically, or the purpose of ritual is to basically use it as like a springboard to kind of like get those emotions out in a psychosomatic way, where you're using symbolism, and it's a theatrical outlet initially. You know, there is and that's really the prime time, or the you know, idea, the prime time idea or reasoning as to what, why ritual is a thing and what it serves and what it's used for, and that's really it. But and there is, you know, this idea that through intense meditation and, you know, through ritual practice, that you can really, you know, the things that you want, or the things that you desire, or the things that you focus on, or the things you love, through that self-realization, those things can come to you. So that's really it. I mean, but other than that, aesthetically, that's one of the reasons I love these films so much, especially films that have those trappings. But I thought it was super interesting that I did not realize that these are the same freaking movies. So hilarious. But Satanic Rites of Dracula, 1973, such an awesome movie. It's definitely on the sleazier side. It's, like I said, it's pretty schlocky. It's kind of terrible at times, but it's so awesome, and I just love it. I love the '70s vibe that it was shot in the '70s, so it's got all the great '70s fashion. You know, the funky music. It's super cool, and I need to eventually get the Satanic Rites on Dracula on Blu-ray. It's essential. So, but thanks again. This is Jason Dean. So I'm gonna be signing off, and if you like this channel and this page, please like and subscribe to it. Stay tuned for the next few videos for the coverage of all things Hammer pertaining to Dracula and Christopher Lee, especially Christopher Lee. There's probably, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 movies to go, so we will see you next time. Peace.